Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Digital Culture Speaker Series. Today, we have with us Lauren Copley. She's an artist, designer, fabricator, researcher, and thinker with an extensive digital background in fabrication, in digital fabrication, in commercial, education, and fine art applications. She received her BFA in jewelry design and photography from Winthrop University in South Carolina in 2013, and she's currently in her final year of ASU's MFA Intermedia program. Her current work focuses on the intersection of research and art, so it makes a lot of sense that she's here with us here at ASU AME. So, Lauren, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Can you guys see that screen? Okay. The between, Grasshopper, data reversal, and dynamic relationality. I am not a scientist or a psychologist. I'm not trying to teach these concepts or even argue their scientific merit. I'm looking at these ideas from a philosophical perspective, being interested in theories that illustrate the dynamic and relational nature of the world. This is the story of how I spent the last 3 years distilling research into my current thesis project. Why did I start this research? I've always wanted to understand the complexities of humanity. Growing up very religious, spirituality used to be my lens for understanding. The older I become, the broader the lens becomes. I don't believe in rejecting, but in expanding. Religion taught me many valuable concepts but reached a limit. Psychology is my current method of expansion. I have a dear friend who came from a rather extreme childhood, and when I first met them, they often confused me. The more they made me question my understanding of humanity, the more I was driven to research. As I researched and contemplated, I realized that in many ways, my friend reminded me of myself. This research and surrounding work has been a transformative experience. It has been profoundly humbling and painful at times, but it has been a journey of both outwards and inwards empathy. The first year's worth of research was summarized in 3 art books. Each book was half text and half illustrations. The first was The Figure in the Ground, exploring themes of contextuality. The second was Empathy, exploring themes of relationality. And the third was Good and Evil, exploring definitions applying to relationships, not objects. The idea behind the illustrated portion of this book was the creature at the top had learned to change colors in response to a chaotic childhood environment, symbolized by rapidly changing colored background. The creature at the bottom is the same one later in life, but now in a stable and consistent environment. The strategies that had protected as a child makes the creature stand out and become unsafe in its adult environment. What hides us in chaos makes us vulnerable in stability. This book looks at the relationship between behavior as defined by Gestalt philosophy, attachment style as defined by attachment theory, and habit formation and learning as defined by neuroscience. The diagram on the left illustrates that these 3 concepts all define the relationship between a background and foreground object. In Gestalt, behavior is defined by the impact of the ground upon the figure. In attachment theory, attachment style is defined by the impact of the caregiver upon the infant. In neuroscience, habits are defined by the impact of environmental inputs upon the brain. The most important concept explored in this book is Kurt Lewin's field theory. B is the function of P and E, where behavior is the function of a person and their environment. This formula could describe the formation of the 3 phenomena explored in the book: behavior, attachment style, and habits. Empathy. This book examines the power of mutual empathy to bring healing and growth, focusing on attachment theory's concept of attunement, a reciprocal state of emotional understanding between 2 people, prompting a loving response. A quote by Bessel van der Kolk, trauma psychologist and author of The Body Keeps the Score, summarizes the importance of attunement. The roots of resilience are to be found in the sense of being understood by and existing in the mind and heart of a loving, attuned, self-possessed other. This chart illustrates an imaginary timeline for 3 different people from an attachment theory perspective. The one on the far left represents an insecure attachment. They began and ended life without experiencing attunement, their emotional state continuing to deteriorate over time. The one in the middle represents the concept of an earned secure attachment. This person began life without attunement, but experienced growth and healing through an attuned relationship with a family member, friend, partner, and a therapist later in life. The one on the far right represents a secure attachment, someone who was born into an environment that offered attunement and was easily able to establish attuned relationships throughout their life. The gradients illustrate the same timeline through color. Yellow represents beginning life with an insecure attachment. Red represents ending life with an insecure attachment. Light blue represents beginning life with a secure attachment, and indigo represents ending life with a secure attachment. A few more selected quotes from the empathy book. Stephen Porges, founder of the polyvagal theory, states, "The responsibility of relationships is to keep our autonomic nervous system out of a state of defense. The purpose of relationships is to co-regulate affective states." His son, Seth Porges, explains how autism, depression, borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, and most psychiatric disorders all share symptoms related to high arousal of the autonomic nervous system. Quote, "A common symptom of most psychiatric disorders is never feeling safe." End quote. In an interview with Dr. Alan Shore, clinical faculty of UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine and researcher in the field of neuropsychology, he was asked, "Do you believe the brain can heal itself?" His response was, "I believe the brain can heal itself optimally when in interaction with another brain. In other words, the self can heal itself when it is in open interaction with another self. Again, it's not just another self who intellectually understands. It's another self who can resonate with the feelings, who gives you the sense that this other person understands what I am feeling from the inside out. We are always co-regulating our internal body states through our relationships. The process of dealing with trauma is the ability to feel these emotional states in the body, to communicate them with another human being, and then for them to be regulated. The origins of trauma are in relationships, therefore the outcome of working with trauma has to be relational." End quote. Empathy definition from the 2019 version of the Merriam-Webster Dictionary: the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of another, either the past or present, without having the feelings, thoughts, and experiences fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. This illustration represents two creatures in a state of reciprocal understanding at the top and misunderstanding at the bottom. Understanding grows, misunderstanding decays. The ideas from this book evolved dramatically beyond what I originally wrote. Their best expression was in a diagram concept that came after the book shown here. The left side of the diagram represents good and the right side represents evil. The upper two good and evil figures are facing each other as opponents. The second row of figures shows them from a different perspective in which their background is also visible. Good has the same shape and color as its background, implying a state of harmony, whereas evil is discordant. The third row shows the original evil figure in a state of harmony with its environment and thus moved to the good column, and the original good figure in a state of discord and moved to the evil column. The implication being definitions such as good and evil apply to relationships, not objects. After the art book series, I spent some time making diagrams, mostly to aid my own understanding and organize my thoughts. This is my version of the attachment graph. There are many schools of attachment theory proposing that early and present relationships define our psychology to varying degrees. The original attachment theory graph outlined 4 quadrants and their relationship to anxiety and avoidance. Secure was low anxiety and low avoidance, preoccupied, high anxiety, low avoidance, dismissive, low anxiety, high avoidance, and fearful or disorganized, which is high anxiety and high avoidance. My rendition of the graph explores the preferred relationship between self and other as a symbol of each quadrant, illustrated through a series of gradients. In my version, secure is comfortable moving back and forth between a blended and separated state of self and other, shown by the soft blend between the two states. Preoccupied is comfortable with a blended state of self and other. Dismissive is comfortable with a separated state of self and other. Fearful, disorganized is uncomfortable in both a separated and blended state of self and other, reactively moving back and forth between two states, shown by a hard line between the two. This idea was inspired by an excerpt from a book by John Welwood, a psychologist known for integrating psychology and spiritual concepts, called Journey of the Heart. Quote, "Through their struggles, they have learned a powerful essential lesson, that relationship, rather than just being a form of togetherness, is a ceaseless flowing back and forth between joining and separating. Just as the moon begins to wane at the peak of its fullness, and the tide ebbs at the height of its flux, so after moments of intense connecting, two partners naturally begin to fall back into their aloneness. And in moments when they feel the most separate, a desire is born to come together again. The health of a relationship depends on both partners being able to move freely back and forth between these two poles, end quote. This graph offers relational definitions implying an open rather than closed system, unlike models such as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health. But it is still static as each quadrant is fixed in nature. This graph was inspired by Patricia Crittenden's dynamic maturational model, a proposed alternative to categorical diagnostic methods. The DMM illustrated a continuum of human behavior rather than rigid quadrants, and was found on the premise that humans transform cognitive and emotional information at subconscious and conscious levels in response to real or perceived danger. Presented as an animation with changing colors illustrating a continuum of reactive strategies, ways we transform information to stay safe in our environment. In my version, the self is broken up into 3 layers: the primary experience, the subconscious interpretation, and the conscious expression. This 3-layered self is further divided into 2 halves, cognition and affect. Cognition and affect range from positive to negative, illustrated by warm and cool colored gradients ranging from dark to light. The 4 quadrants of the circular continuum are: top, comfortable; perceived safety, predicts unconditional care; the most transparent; fully integrated true information; protects in safety, makes vulnerable in danger. Could be thought of as the secure quadrant of the attachment graph. The far right uses affect to negatively transform cognition. Could be thought of as the preoccupied quadrant of this attachment graph. Far left uses cognition to positively transform affect. Could be thought of as the dismissive quadrant of the attachment graph. Bottom, psychopathy. Perceived danger, care cannot be predicted, the most opaque, fully integrated false information, protects in danger, but makes vulnerable in safety. This diagram is too complex to be fully accessible by a novice viewer, but constructing allowed me to more deeply understand the concepts. This diagram illustrates a flattened versus dimensional or relational view of humanity. The imagery came from years of comparing flattened and closed versus dimensional and open psychology models. A few quotes that inspired this work. There are no things, there are only relationships, Syrian McGilchrist. If I say a table is hard, what I mean is that in a war between my hand and the table won, Gregory Bateson. Definitions are in the between. Dialectical behavior therapy, validation. Alan Frizzetti is the director of the Training and Family Services at Harvard's McLean Hospital. From his bio, he has adapted and implemented dialectical behavior therapy, a therapy for people who struggle with emotion regulation, particularly those who have borderline personality disorder, for underserved populations. Frizzetti believes we are born with a biological temperament, which he describes as varying levels of sensitivity, reactivity, and recovering time. And our psychological strategies for relating to the world come from how well our temperament is received by our environment. Dialectical behavior therapy is a unique approach using existing relationships and the relationship with a therapist to gain emotion regulation skills. A key concept of DBT is validation. Frizzetti's mantra for relating to our loved ones is validate the valid, don't validate the invalid, and invalidate the invalid infrequently. He speaks on the power of validation to downregulate intense emotions. Expressing normalcy and understanding changes overwhelming emotions into manageable ones. This is a very similar to attachment theory's concept of attunement, which again is a reciprocal state of emotional understanding between 2 humans, prompting a loving response. This is my attempt to understand Frizzetti's concept of the 7 levels of validation visually. These were eventually going to be an animation moving through the different levels, but I only completed the first 2 before they birthed a new idea. Another instance of a 3-layered self, this time the innermost layer is the primary emotion, which is sent through the 2nd layer of biological temperament, and then is sent through an outer transformational barrier comprised of learned defenses, history, and current biological state. The self has 2 extensions, a perceivable self and a perceiving self, positioned in opposite order of the other. The perceivable self receives transmissions from the primary emotion that is passed through the layers of biological temperament and transformational barrier, and the perceiving self receives transmissions from the information obtained from the other's perceivable self. The self and other are both receiving and sending transformed emotional signals, and as the 7 levels of validation are worked through, the sent and received signals more closely reflect the primary emotion. This diagram concept ties together attachment theory's attunement, dialectical behavior therapy's validation, and the dynamic maturational model's idea of information transformation. Early sculptural and performative concepts. This diagram would have been made of CNC routed plywood and hand-dyed sintered nylon 3D prints. The concept is for a physical diagram showing a timeline of attunement and misattunement. The upper timeline shows a pair of figures in a state of attunement, illustrated by matching colors and puzzle piece shapes at the point of reception. Attunement over time is causing the figures to grow. The lower timeline shows a pair of figures in a state of misattunement, illustrated by mismatched colors and ill-fitting shapes at the point of reception. Misattunement over time is causing the figures to decay. The space between sculptural concept was working towards an open, 3-dimensional system with a first attempt at dynamism. Although the result is still static, as the shapes defined the self and other are fixed. An arcade-esque sculpture would stand in a room with mirrors on either side where a screen would usually be. A flat geometric pattern would be printed on both mirrors. Viewers would see their face surrounded by the flat pattern when they approach the sculpture. There would be printed instructions explaining that if 2 people stand on opposite sides and push the button on their side at the same time, something will happen. When 2 people push the buttons, the mirror on either side would slowly lower, revealing a lit tunnel comprised of the same shapes as the flat pattern on the mirror. When participants looked through the tunnel, they would see the face of the other participant on the other side, softly glowing with the colored light of their side of the tunnel. What appeared in a flattened view on the mirror to be an individual object's property was actually patterns outlining the dimensional space between 2 figures. Looking deep into your own reflection cannot explain your emotional or mental state. These things exist in the exchange between you and your environment. Another attempt at dynamism, but still relatively static because participants have to choose from pre-selected emotion and somatic words. I plan to eventually develop a unique symbol for each word. This card game had a series of instructions for practicing emotional empathy. People should take a few minutes to familiarize themselves with their deck of cards. Cards will describe negative and positive emotional and somatic states. You should decide who is going to speak first and who is going to listen first. The listener will ask, "How was your day?" As the speaker describes their day, the listener should attempt to empathetically focus on subjective cues, such as facial expressions, tone, and inflection. They should try to feel in their body what they sense the other person is feeling in theirs, refraining from all judgment. They may also receive visual impressions or other nonverbal insights as the speaker talks. As the speaker describes their day, the speaker should also pay attention to subjective cues. They should open themselves to how they feel about their day, what bodily sensations occur, and how the nonverbal attention of the listener is affecting them. After the speaker is finished, each person should pick as many cards as best describe their nonverbal sensations during the interaction. When the selections have been made, each person should lay their card choice out to be seen by both parties. The listener should describe what they felt and any impressions they received. The speaker should describe what they felt and acknowledge any truths discerned by the listener. The 2 should then switch roles and repeat. This is not about being immediately good at emotional empathy. It is about practicing a crucial human skill in a safe and accepting environment. Do not be discouraged if your partner doesn't resonate with what you felt. It may have touched them in ways you aren't comfortable acknowledging. Be gracious with yourself and others, exercising emotional empathy to strengthen connections. I have printed versions of these cards in my studio and have played this game with several visitors. It's always an enlightening experience. But it was still too flat for my goal of dynamism, and I found that people have so many preconceived notions surrounding emotion words that it is hard to accurately understand each other. Shortly after developing the card game, I came across a study called Modeling Semantic Emotion Space Using a 3D Hypercube Projection, an innovative analytical approach for the psychology of emotions, a 2016 study done in the Czech Republic. The study challenges the widely accepted 2-dimensional model of emotion categorization, graphing emotions based on valence, which is the degree of pleasantness, and activation. It proposes instead a four-dimensional model using utility, valence, arousal, and control. The author's intro, quote, "Language is a primary tool of emotion research and the primary access to the affective experience of the self and others. The key importance of research instruments inspired in psycholinguistics is apparent when exploring the research designs of empirical studies in this field. Aside from some experimental and observational research, a huge number of current empirical studies use linguistic properties when exploring the terrain of human emotional experience. People construct and understand their emotional experience through the abstract representations of emotion in language. For this reason, it is not surprising that psycholinguistics attract many researchers who seek out the links between language, cognitive processes, and emotional experience. The present study follows just this line of research and investigates interrelations between the experiential component of emotions and the anchoring of emotional concepts in language," end quote. 187 university students were asked to rate 16 emotion words based on utility, valence, arousal, and control. The results showed that there was no significant correlation between these four axes, so they could indeed be used as four separate measures of subjective emotional space. At the time, I was learning Grasshopper, a visual coding plugin for Rhino. I thought, what if I use the data points from this study to draw the shape of each emotion? That would be a perfect Grasshopper project. If emotions, imagery, and metaphors are the language of the subconscious, perhaps translating emotion words into a visual representation would help us understand each other at a deeper level. So I designed this base unit of emotion with a quadrant for valence, arousal, control, and utility. I used the scale of 0 to 100 from the study, setting 50 as 0 or neutral, and any number above would be a protrusion, and any number below would be a recession. I gave each quadrant a unique number of control points and varied between arced connections and angled connections so that each quadrant had a different and recognizable appearance. This was the final result using the 16 emotion words from the study: anger, fear, sadness, happiness, disgust, hope, love, hate, contempt, guilt, compassion, shame, gratefulness, envy, disappointment, and jealousy. I also explored making a three-dimensional version of the shapes. This one is love. While the study was successful in proving that emotion words can be graphed on four axes, I was most interested in the standard deviation between the participants' responses. The shapes I drew from the data were averaged and said little about the individual responses. The way we speak about emotions is subjective. The true understanding necessary for attunement, again, a reciprocal state of emotional understanding between two people prompting a loving response, can't be achieved through words alone. But can language help us go beyond averaged words towards a more subjective meaning? And can that subjective experience begin to be understood at a subconscious level through translation to imagery? Can seeing the emotions of another and sharing the shape of our own emotions help us to experience reciprocal empathy? Referring back to Shore's quote, can I design a tool to help us heal ourselves through open interaction with another self, dealing with trauma through feeling these emotional states in the body, communicating them to another human being, and then for them to be regulated? I designed a new unit of emotion, this time tying in earlier research and including a representation of the broader context. Context is here symbolized by Fruzzetti's concept of biological temperament, being measured in sensitivity, reactivity, and recovery time. Current state is here symbolized by emotion, being measured in utility, valence, arousal, and control. I then had the realization that Grasshopper could allow for in-person responses to generate unique geometry on site. The first draft was somewhat between my new idea and the old card game. Users would answer a series of questions about their current emotional state and their temperament at a kiosk within the gallery. Then a card would be printed with their results. Instructions on the card would have them share their answers with another attendee and practice validating responses. Data acquisition queries that were once used to gain a broader understanding of humans across time are now being used to gain an intimate understanding of one human in the present and to share that understanding reciprocally with another. Then COVID happened, and I started to contemplate how this tool could be accessible to people beyond a gallery setting. How could I bring this into people's homes? That brought up the idea of a web app. I did some research and found an API specifically for Grasshopper called Shapediver. This version only has the individual viewer currently, as I'm still writing the code for the dyadic viewer. It's still very much a work in progress. The goal is to exist primarily as a mobile web app in the end. Can you guys see that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, so this is the web app currently. At the bottom is the tool. So it says, it is often difficult to understand what we feel, let alone translate those feelings into words. This tool seeks to bypass the usual ways of categorizing emotion and have users attempt to discern their feelings based on 4 distinct axes, inspired by the study modeling semantic emotion space. Users will also attempt to discern their temperament, the biological predisposed way of interacting with the world. You may use this tool individually to better understand the between of you and your current state, or you may use this tool with a loved one to better understand the between of you and them. A different type of visualization will be generated for individual or couple inputs. And so I modified the questions so that they make a little bit more sense to a layperson. How useful is this feeling? Lower numbers would mean this feeling is motivating your thoughts or behavior in an unhelpful way. Higher numbers would mean this feeling is motivating your thoughts or behavior in a helpful way. And then it's on a sliding scale of 1 to 10. And as they adjust, you'll see this one is adjusting the upper inside of the shape. The next one is how pleasant is this feeling? Lower numbers would mean this feeling is less enjoyable. Higher numbers would mean this feeling is more enjoyable. How much control do you have over this feeling? Lower numbers would mean you're aware of this feeling, but it isn't dictating your thoughts or behavior. Higher numbers would mean this feeling is controlling your current thoughts or behavior. I think I'm having internet connection problems. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine.
Okay.
And we can see the visual as well.
How much control do you have over this feeling? How intense is this feeling? And then the temperament questions. How sensitive are you? And that's going to begin to change the outside. How reactive are you? And then how long does it take you to recover? I don't think this shape is refreshing. All right, so that's just the single person view. So users would answer the questions and they'll get a unique shape depending on what they answer. And then for the 2-person view, this was an early test. It just has the outside portion, the temperament portion. The inside emotion portion has not been done yet. Here, I can show you this in Rhino though, so you can see it actually moving. Can you guys see Rhino? So this would be one person's answers. If they answer higher, you can see that it's actually changing the shape all the way through, not just the one side. And then the same on the other side. So the idea would be that 2 people would answer and it would give a unique shape for the space between them. And then here's all of my very messy Grasshopper code. The power of code as a medium. As Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. The conceptual evolution of this project could be told through the medium evolution. Static printed graphics to somewhat dynamic animation, sculpture, and performances to truly dynamic code. A generalized story to a somewhat more nuanced story to a truly personalized story. Flattened to more dimensional to three-dimensional. And that's the end. Thanks to all my friends and family for listening to me talk about these ideas for 3 years now, and often helping me sort through my thoughts. Thanks to Meredith Hoy for being the most supportive thesis chair imaginable. To Shapediver for finding the project interesting enough to grant me a free license of their Grasshopper API, and to you all for listening.
Fantastic talk, Lauren. Let's open the floor to questions. I saw a few going through the chat already. Diana, would you like to ask your question on the microphone?
Yes, but that was fantastic, Lauren. Great job. It was really inspiring and terrific. And I missed the beginning. Imagine if I'd seen the whole thing. So I was really jazzed and inspired by your work. That's terrific. I had several questions, but one was just technically, how did you choose the emotions that you did choose to then visualize? And how did you attribute numerical values, as you mentioned you did? Maybe that's something that I missed, but I was curious. And then thirdly, this is kind of a bonus extra one. So what comes next? I can certainly imagine an exhibition. I can imagine an augmented publication, or all kinds of things that, you know, I'm applying my Leonardo bias towards. But it was beautiful to see your work at this stage, and we'd be curious. That's the shadow of visiting artist Bill Ayton. I'd be curious to see your work in person in some way. I think a lot of people would want to share in that.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions too. To answer your first question, the 16 emotions were from that original study that was the Czech Republic study, graphing emotions on 4 different axes. So they just picked 16 emotions that they considered to be the most basic emotions. And that was their choice. And then I just used their data points for the numbers. They had participants, they gave them like a centimeter and had them mark. They had 10 different increments on the centimeter and had them mark somewhere on there, and then measured that to get the numbers. So there's like, it was on a scale of 1 to 10. And then I used those numbers. I did it on 1 to 100 to have a little bit finer control over it, and then use the same numbers though to plus or minus to get the shape. Does that answer that part of the question? And then as far as the in-person component to the work, I have my thesis show in the spring. I'm still figuring out exactly how this work is going to be displayed, but right now I'm thinking if I can have a gallery situation, I would love to have like a standing kiosk for people to be able to answer the questions with another gallery participant, and then a hologram display of the final results, and then possibly be able to print cards for them to take home with them as well.
I have a question as well. So I think you brought up a very important point, which was that there's a lot of linguistic study behind this as well, in terms of the language we use to express our emotion. I guess there's interesting kind of questions that would come from sociolinguistic perspectives of, are we using the right language to talk about emotions, and do different cultures and their values and the language that emanates from that values express different things differently, different emotions differently. Did you, in your practice, feel like there was a lack of certain language, or did you feel like the language encompassed all of what you were feeling through your work, or did you kind of unveil almost like through your exploration where there might be a lack of language to describe certain emotions and feelings?
Yeah, I think language definitely fails in that area. I would say that my thought with not actually, I had an earlier version of this where I was going to have people try to attach a specific emotion word to what they were feeling. And then I did away with that concept pretty quickly for exactly the reasons that you're saying. I thought it'd be interesting to see how much more nuanced the responses could be if we didn't actually attach a word that we already associate with something and have our own ideas about, and maybe other people have different ideas about that word. And if we just looked at terms that could be perceived as slightly more neutral.
I think Meredith has her hand up. Meredith, would you like to go?
Or I guess I can lower my hand, huh? I've actually never used the raised hand function before.
Well, it worked.
Right. So Lauren, thank you. That was beautiful and fascinating as always. And I was saying to Lauren earlier that it's difficult to come up with a question in this context because we've worked together for a long time now, and I know her and her work very well, and love it very much, and her very much. Anyway, so what I was thinking this time is that in all of these modalities, right, you're navigating through modes of conveying information, but then enabling that emotion to be, or that information to become experiential, right? So that's it's sort of a complex, not sort of, it's a very complex kind of involution, right? Because how do you both convey information and add the sort of sensory, experiential, emotional level into it, right? So you're doing something much more than information visualization, right? Now I'm thinking of the diagrams. What kind of experience do you see in the diagrams, in watching the diagrams move and grow and shift? What kind of experience do you think that they elicit in a participant and a user that they might not otherwise have with a story, right? Because you have, in the end, you have stories, and then you have the diagrams that are much more than visualizations, I think.
Are you referring to more of the diagrams before the final iteration of the work?
Well, I mean, there is all these iterations, right? You have the diagrams, and then you have the creatures, which are sort of diagrams in the sense that they're life-like, but they're not anthropomorphized, right? And they're illustrated. But then when you move into the dynamic code as another way of thinking through the diagram, I guess. And then, okay, so the second half of that sentence then would be, how do you think that allows, in seeing that, how do you think that allows viewers to, or participants, users to engage with, or sort of click into experiential mode that they wouldn't otherwise?
Yeah, I hope that the fact that they are seeing a highly individualized image that is a representation of what they themselves have just said that they're feeling helps it to seem more personal and impactful, and then sharing that with another person would be a more meaningful experience. Because if you're just looking at a diagram, you're like, oh, I think I fall at this place on this diagram, it's still very generalized and you haven't contributed to it at all. But in this way, viewers are basically making a portrait of how they're feeling in that moment and sharing that with someone. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm going to say one more thing, that there's there's an intimacy there, right? That and that's sort of what this is about, right? And yet, and this is more of a comment than a question, and I love that you're doing this. You're taking code, various software, right? And using it to create these shapes that are dynamic, but that might not be the most intuitive pathway to achieve an experience of intimacy, the way that code is sort of popularly understood or conceived of, right? So I think that's something to keep thinking through, not as a problem, but just as a phenomenon of what you're doing. That's it.
Thank you.
I think Diana has another question. Or, Kim has a question too.
Yeah, this is a follow-up on what Meredith just brought up. I am wondering about the result that participants would get from the web app, which is this beautiful personalized shape. Do they get a chance to see other examples of the shape that would represent other emotional experiences, so that there's some comparison of, when I'm feeling this way, it has this expansion or this color, and when I'm feeling this other way, it looks a different way. And I'm wondering if you've seen participants do this kind of over time and have a different reaction to it if they do it kind of multiple times in different states.
That's a really interesting thought. I had an earlier idea where I was going to catalog every response that anybody made and have people assign some sort of word to it to make a gallery, so like people could look and see like everybody who said anger and like all of those responses, what did they look like? But then I started to think that might still make it too generalized for people. But I like what you brought up. It might be interesting for people to have their own gallery that they keep, and it's not necessarily everybody who uses the app, it's just them, and they can see their responses over time, and they can maybe make a few notes about them, and it doesn't just have to be one word to describe them, but maybe they can write down what they were feeling that day or why they answered, and they can go back and sort of have a diary of these things. That would be really interesting. I like that.
Diana?
Okay, I'm gonna have to love you and leave you. But I'll leave you with a question, which is about, it's about you, Lauren, and how this practice and research has affected your own experience of empathy. How has this deepened your own empathetic imagination?
In lots of ways. For me, it's helped me be a lot more in tune with my own emotions. I have to say, before I started this research, I thought of myself as somebody who understood myself really well. But the more I have done this and started to pay attention to what I'm actually feeling in a moment and try harder to share that with someone, the more I've realized that I actually am usually only communicated on a very surface level, as are many people, I think. So it's definitely made me work to be more vulnerable when I already thought that I was being pretty vulnerable, but realized that there's much deeper to go. And it's, as I said at the beginning, it's been uncomfortable at times, but it's been a really good thing to learn.
Thanks for that lovely response, Lauren. Does anybody have any other questions? If not, let's, Byron does.
Yeah, quick.
Yes, please, Byron.
So I think it's really fascinating to see your work and see your thinking behind all this. It's great to see the kind of the evolution of that. I think one of the things you said that really struck me, and it's so true, is this, that everything is relational. And to me, when I see these final sort of three-dimensional forms that are emerging, that's what I think very much about, is like, okay, what's the sort of the complementary form of this, and what's, how do these things, how are they self-similar or how are they dissimilar? How do they couple or not couple? So I don't know if there's really a question here, but just that's definitely an observation that it's really, I see a lot of potential within that relational, formation. I mean, there might be something where eventually this could programmatically, like these things could fit together or not in interesting ways dynamically.
Thank you. That's a good comment.
Okay, well, I think that we'll close out for today, but thank you so much, Lauren. It was a very fantastic talk. And this actually concludes the Digital Culture Speaker Series for fall 2020. So thank you all for joining us on this fantastic adventure. All right.
Nice
see you all.
work. Thank you.